Today we're going to be talking and discussing about how we can help cure your identity crisis. I think so many people have an identity crisis, they really do not know who they are. They're either chasing after something, money, career, or they want to be something else other than themselves. They might even be running away from something such as the past or other people. The cure to the identity crisis is reflecting on life so you can really discover who you are and to know what God's plan is for you. In our high-speed technological world and our self-absorbed and busy society, we need to take time to reflect and discover ourselves, what God created us for, and be the champion for Christ that He is calling us to be, regardless of our faults, our weaknesses, or strengths or talents. I have a guest speaker today, Robert Hanley, who will help us with our identity crisis. Robert Hanley is a famous celebrity who has been in Hollywood movies, a singer, author, stand-up comedian, game host, and in many TV shows. Overall, he's a great guy who loves Christ and others.
Welcome to another episode of Practical Catholic with David Suess. Practical Catholic is a spiritual coaching show to help you find peace, love, and joy in family and work life. We are here each and every week to help you grow spiritually, to become successful in this life, and to be a saint for the life after.
You know, my story begins with me in a sense that, you know, I'm a Korean. That means I'm Asian, and I was adopted at the age of 5 when I came here to America. And it's very, very awkward to be, you know, an Asian amongst a white family and a white society. It was very, very awkward. And so for me, it was something that I had to live with in doing that. I remember when I was little, there was a television show, and I didn't see it when I was little, but when I was a little older, I got to see this movie called The Jerk with Steve Martin. And there's a scene in there where Steve Martin, who's all white, was adopted by an all-black family, and where he's about, I guess, 30 years old, and it's his birthday, and this whole family looks at him, and they say, son, you're adopted. And in that scene, Steve Martin says, you mean I'm going to stay this color? Thinking that he was going to all of a sudden change to become a black person, because that's exactly what his brothers and sisters and his whole family was. And ironically speaking, that's exactly how I felt. I thought somehow I was going to turn into this white person, change from a brown person. Not that I was, unhappy with me being Korean or anything like that, but I just didn't understand, especially growing up in a white society. So it was important that I really did understand who I was. And so and I was faced with a lot of prejudice, racism growing up as well. Not because people were racist, but because, kids can be nasty at young ages, and so they can say things that are derogatory towards other people. So I was able to really reflect a lot about who I was. And at a very young age, I did that. At a very young age, I realized who I really was, and I realized also that I loved myself, It's so important to love yourself. And it was the challenge of, not seeming that I fit in, that I was able to really understand who I was and how to love myself. Because the Lord says to love your neighbor as yourself. Because if you don't love yourself, it's very hard to love other people. So today, the road to, loving yourself and knowing who you are begins with with self-reflection, to reflect on all the situations that occur. Who am I? What am I? And so I have a really great guest speaker here. Not only did he write a great book, this book called Do You See What I See? Discovering the Obvious. It's a great book. I've read it. The author's name is Robert Hanley. He is an actor, a singer. He's been in movies, been on television shows. And today we're going to talk about reflection and how we can, discover who we are based on his really, really good book. I highly recommend it, called Do You See What I See? Discovering the Obvious. So, hello, Robert. How you doing?
I'm doing just fine, and thank you for that story that you told, which I'm sure anybody listening can relate to. I know I can, and I appreciated it. I garnered something from it, and I wasn't expecting it, so thank you. I'm doing fine, by the way, and happy to be on your show, and here I am.
Oh, thank you. So, I know we've talked back and forth about your life. I enjoyed. In fact, I watched a couple of your videos of your past movies and shows, and it brought back a lot of memories as a Generation X person. Just tell us a little bit about your life, and especially how you came. I don't know. Did you leave your faith? Did you come back to your faith, or were you always strong in your faith?
I was born and raised a Catholic, altar boy, and all of that. And when I got to my teenage years, as is often the case with others, I wasn't going to church, and then maybe Christmas and Easter I would go to Mass, and my journey eventually led me. Somebody suggested, they said to me, "Do you go to church?" And I said, "No, I feel I'm a good person," and just wasn't going to Mass. I felt there was a lot of hypocrisy as well that I was seeing in some of the people at church and at the time, and just my interests were in other things, more worldly things. And then somebody said, listening to you, Robert, and as I got to know you, you might want to check back into church, because I see your thoughts and the way you live your life as something that seems parallel to going to church. And somewhat reluctantly, but not too bad, somebody says something to me. I saw the value in that, and I thought, well, let me check back in. And I went to church, a Catholic church in Encino, California, called Our Lady of Grace, and never stopped. That was in 1983. So I could remember going to confession after about the second or third visit to church, and let me back that up a little bit. Those first two or three visits to church, I remember hearing the priest read the gospel and then do the homily, and I was sitting there saying to myself, gee, what happened to Jesus it sounds similar to what happened to me with this agent that I had at the time, a similar experience. And sort of my life on the outside, away from the church, really started to come to fit with what the basic tenets of our church are and God. So being raised, going to Catholic school, going to Catholic grammar school, going to Catholic high school, I got all the fundamentals in my brain, but I didn't really experience them. But I found the value of the church at the time with I could see it come alive with my experience more as an adult. So anyway, I went to confession and told the priest all my sins. I actually used words to that effect. Father, I've done it all, and I'd like to come. I'm sorry for my sins. And he just said to me, a funny thing, by the way, it had been so long. When I knelt down in the confessional, he slid the door open, and I was inches away from his face. And to somebody who hadn't been to confession in many, many years, it was quite startling. I sort of turned to my left to look around. Is this the way it goes now? And after telling him what I told him, he simply said, well, welcome back. And he said, why don't you just go back into the church there, Neil, and just spend a moment with God. And I thought that was great, and that really sealed the deal for me. And little did I know at that time, but if somebody had asked me, I would, I was really taken by it. And I became, as time went by, I became very, very involved with the church, and that was 1983. Did I say that? Yeah. And since then, I have been, I hosted all the events. I became a lector and then a lector coordinator, belonged to the men's group, and then there are many other things that I'm not recalling at this moment, but I've just been greatly involved with the church to the point where I formed a group, not at the church. I did at the church at one point, but during that growth period, being that I was in show business as an actor predominantly, I've done maybe 100 or more television shows and a few pictures, and as you mentioned, stand-up comedy, and just singing with my own 17-piece orchestra. And I started to performing for nonprofits because I played Vegas a few times, many times actually, relating to comedy. But I wanted to use my talents to see if I could help nonprofits, the church, different faiths, whether they were Christians, Protestant places that were doing good for this world. So you talk about finding yourself, and that was a moment where I thought, gee, this is good. This is helping people, and I'm doing something I enjoy. And, I could use a sliding scale as far as what, many of these places do not have a lot of money, and we'd make it work, and it just was very good, and I did that for a number of years. But I think the predominant thing during that period was I started a group called the Entertainment Fellowship, which basically brought God and career together for people in the entertainment industry. And we had each month, we had discussion meetings at 5 different parishes in Los Angeles, and I wrote the material along with a Catholic priest, actually, who I asked to be chaplain, Father Bert Billett. He's a Claretian priest. And we addressed topics at these discussion meetings, and addressed them from a practical and a spiritual standpoint. And not only did we have these discussion meetings at 5 different locations in LA regularly, we also had guest speaker dinners from the entertainment industry, and that was at CBS that we did that. And they would come in, people who were successful in front of the camera and behind the camera, such as Diane Cannon, Steve Allen, Jimmy Burrows, who he's one of the most renowned, if not the most renowned, sitcom comedy director. They spoke, the president of CBS, and I would ask them in front of an audience, what was your journey like? What do you see as, do you have a faith? Some of them were Catholic, some of them were Jewish. Some of these people that I interviewed, we always had a member of the clergy there, and they would talk about their journey, about trying to do the right thing in an industry that's not known for that. So it was good for the people attending to hear the journeys of other people. And we grew to, before I get to that, we also had a screening each month to show new or soon-to-be-released films, and we'd address them, from a spiritual and from a practical standpoint. In other words, if there was a scene that used curse words, were they necessary? And there would be writers and directors in the audience, and how would you have done that? Does that offend you? Is that the way people talk? And is that necessary in a film? And I can remember one time saying to somebody, in all the Rocky films, Rocky Balboa and all of that, there was never a curse word, because a lot of people feel that in New York, that scene in the De Niro, Pacino films, and they're filled with gratuitous language. And people are acceptable to that, whether they're in the film or outside the film, but, it's certainly not something that I espouse in my own life. But the conversations at these films were along those lines, and it was very healthy, and it gave an opportunity for people who are wanting to do the right thing. It sort of enforces their own morality or ethics, if you will. And then we also had a 12-page newsletter that went out to, and I'll mention this at this time, the group at this point grew to 4,000 people in the entertainment industry. So, and I was experiencing, I mean, we had predominant names, as I mentioned, in it, and as well as people, young actors or wannabe actors, as well as people who have wanted to make a career out of show business. You know, maybe they did 1 or 2 films or appeared on TV, or people like myself who have managed to make a living at it over the years, who were challenged as time went by. You know, how do I keep going? You know, I'm paying the rent just barely, and you know, and I had my own experiences with that. You know, people look at my resume sometimes and they go, "Wow, you did all of this," and I say, for every one of those that I got, you know, I didn't get 10 or more, you know, jobs, a lot of rejection. So we'd help with these discussion meetings in the newsletter in that regard. So it was a point where my life as someone in show business returned to my faith in a big way, and that led to writing a book. As you mentioned, it's called "Do You See What I See? Discovering the Obvious," and it's about finding a better, more meaningful life. It's and I use the book at my parish now and other places that are asking me to do this. I use the book in a similar way to what I did with the Entertainment Fellowship, only this is open to people of all faiths. And it's not just people in the entertainment industry, and we are just beginning our 9th consecutive year at Our Lady of Grace in Encino. And what we do is, you know, the chapters in the book deal with change and how making a change in your life can be a good thing. From a practical standpoint, which is a story that I wrote about me pulling into a gas station and garnering something profound by the experience. And then not only from the practical standpoint, but I also write a spiritual aspect as far as change, as far as why are you living the way you're living? What is it you want to do? And the changes that our Lord brought to so many people, and what the church brings to help people by changing their lives for the better. So things like change and work, having a work ethic, and applying that and coming up with a short story on it, an anecdote, if you will. Seeing things in that short story that seem to just float past the observations of other people. In other words, as I mentioned, pulling into a gas station, people are just getting gas and they're in a hurry, but if you stop and look at the experience and apply it to your own life, whether it's a gas station or your career on your job, I address all of these topics of work and coincidence, and I'm just trying to think off the top of my head some of the other chapters. Perseverance, where you are, you're trying for something. If I may, I was hosting the Special Olympics for a number of years, many years actually, and I remember seeing this little gal who Rayford Johnson introduced her, and he said, "I'd like to introduce somebody. She's 10 years old, and she never walked in her life before, and she would like to walk for you now." And we were at UCLA, and a hush came over the stadium, and there were over 1,000 people there. And this little girl got up out of a wheelchair, and she swung her leg around and took a step. And you were holding your breath watching this. And then she sort of swayed a little bit, and I thought to myself, gee, she's going to fall. She reminded me of somebody who had drunk too much alcohol, and she took another step, and then she fell. And she managed to get her. So everybody was wondering what's going to happen. You wanted to help her, but nobody went to her to pick her up. She got up on her own, and she took another step and another step, and fell down again. And nobody picked her up. And she got up on her own, and I took a couple of steps and fell down again, a few more steps, fell down again. And after about 25 feet, her coach was on his knees with his upturned hands and with a smile on his face, and I could see that from where I was standing. And she slapped his hands, and it was just so moving. And the entire stadium just burst out into applause. It was quite touching, and people it was in the middle of the field on risers, and people on the stage, so to speak, were giving her hugs. And then at one point, the coach grabbed her hand and raised it above her head as if she was the heavyweight champion of the world. And he let her go, and she just stood there and waved to the crowd. And as I say in this story on Perseverance, it was the greatest applaud I've ever heard. And believe me, I've worked with Sammy Davis Jr., I've worked with Jerry Seinfeld, I've worked with a lot of people in the industry, and I've heard a lot of applause, but this took the cake. And obviously, or maybe not so obvious to the people watching, or even to your listeners now, when she walked down that narrow black mat to her coach 25 feet later, I think of us, all of us in life, when we go through life, how do we persevere? Do we ever take a look and respect ourselves for what we're doing? Because we all walk down our respective black mats, our respective heading towards our respective coaches, so to speak. And to learn that, to respect yourself and to persevere through challenges, wasn't it the getting up that we respected most about her? Isn't it the getting up that we respect most about other people in our lives when they lose a spouse? When something negative happens in their life, they forget that they got through it. And that's something beautiful and something to be admired. I mean, I just had a meeting with the Fireside Fellowship, which I started, as I said, at Our Lady of Grace. And in it, I mentioned, and it came up as well, but one of the questions I asked is, how do you relate perseverance to what the Catholic Church is going through today with sexual abuse?
Good point. Yeah, good
and it was all of these meetings are engaging, but this was particularly engaging. One of the people in our parish, and I mentioned this in the spiritual reflection. Well, I mentioned our Lord and his passion, of course. I mentioned St. Paul and being all he went through, spending nights on the water and being beaten and stoned and starved and everything else he went through, and how did he persevere. And then I mentioned two people. The first one was at this meeting. And I put this into the what I wrote from a spiritual aspect. And she said to me at one point, her name is Mary, and she said, Robert, I came home one day and I was, I asked my daughter, I said, honey, are you here? And there was no response. And her daughter was, I think, 19 or 20 at the time. And she, looked in the kitchen and the living room and finally heard the daughter's room. And then finally she went into the bathroom and her daughter had hung herself. And she was hanging there. And she, you say to yourself, after you say, oh my gosh, Mary, I'm so sorry. And you ask, how did she get through that? To which I did ask her. And she said, I prayed to the Blessed Mother. She said, I feel funny that may sound funny that I didn't pray to Jesus, but I prayed to the Blessed Mother because of what she had gone through with her own son. And she said, and that helped me and continues to help me to this day. She said, Robert, that is what got me through this. Mm. And then at our church the previous Sunday, and I wrote this in the spiritual right after the paragraph or two on Mary, I wrote about a young man who stood up at Mass the Sunday before, 3 days before, and this was just a couple of months ago. And after the homily, he stood up and audibly said to the priest from the congregation, from the pews, he said, excuse me, Father, but recently there's been something that came out about the Catholic Church in Pennsylvania, and I'm wondering if you could say a few words on that. And the priest was a little caught off guard, naturally. Good priest, by the way. Mm-hmm. And then the parishioner, who was also at our meeting, he turned to the congregation and said, how can you support a church that has sexually abused our children and has covered up all of this? And it was quite a stir, and some people told him to shut up and sit down, and other people said later on, they came up to him and said, thank you for saying that, because that's needed. We need to open a window and have a healthy time. We need to open a window and get truth in here about this. He himself was abused. Back to the meeting, and this was all in what I wrote. And there were 25 of us at this particular meeting, which is usually the case each month. And I said, what do we do as far as perseverance here? How do we persevere with our faith under what we're going through? Ending with, for us, some things are impossible. If our child dies, if we are sexually abused, it's impossible for us to get through on our own. But with God, everything is possible. And for both of those individuals, they come to these meetings and they share their feelings the same way other people feel them, the feelings that other people have. So for me, in a perhaps a long way here, explaining it to you, for me, my journey has been one that has led me to where I am today, and I feel very fulfilled that I am a part, that God has tapped me on the shoulder to be a part of what He is offering to all of us on a daily basis. Why? Because it's brought me fulfillment. It has brought me a sense of who I am, the person I have become and am still becoming, that I think God wants me to become. And it's brought me great joy. I was just saying to somebody the other day on Christmas Eve day, that, reminiscing that a few years ago I said to somebody that, I must say I'm not a perfect person, but I like the person that I am, the person I am becoming. And I said to them on Christmas Eve, these two friends of mine, after I said that, I said, I am very rich in the important things in life. I have great love. I have a wonderful wife who I refer to in the book as 1 in a billion. And it is, for me, she is 1 in a billion. And I have hope for the future. I have hope and trust in God. And, I am grateful every day, audibly grateful every day, looking out the window at my backyard while washing dishes and getting tears in my eyes, recognizing all that God has given me by way of my family and the people in my life. So I think that's the best way to, and I know this is going to sound strange now that I've been talking for 2.5 hours, but in a succinct way, from show business, and I don't think I mentioned I'm from the Bronx, New York, and, my upbringing in show business and making mistakes, going away from the church, coming back to the church, getting involved in the church, while still doing my career by still, being funny and singing and writing and whatever else I do. I think I've managed to be a conduit for what God is calling me to do. So there you go.
Yeah. No, I definitely think you are. I want to read, your book here. I think it succinctly kind of tells you what this book is all about and what you're trying to achieve. And I really like this part. It's actually in the conclusion. So we're going to, I always do this. I always read the back first before I read the front. So it
Are
says
you dyslexic? Is that what you're telling me?
I always like to read the ending of the book before I read the book. But it says here in the conclusion, which I think is so beautiful, it says, "Do you see what I see? Maybe you do, and maybe you don't. I understand. Either way, this is not so much about my journey as it is yours. The main thing is to discover the obvious in the daily experiences of your own life. While you may have learned something from an individual story of mine, these experiences are just samples of what I've discovered and how I've become the person I am. It's your experiences and the way you see life that matters. This is the road being offered here, and this road ultimately leads to you. Finding a more meaningful life is linked to discovering who you really are, and who you are is not necessarily who you've become. One of the greatest benefits and perhaps the main goal of discovering the obvious is to discover who you really are. To do that, you've got to spend more time with yourself. Who are you? How often we answer this question with our name followed by what we do for a living. I love that in a sense that, it brings out a couple of things. One is everyday experiences, even the smallest little things like going to the gas station or wherever it is, and you observe. You can really, if you reflect on it, you can really see who you really are. It's so beautiful. One of the stories that I love the most was discovering who you are was the tennis player and the actress. I don't know if you want to tell that story, but I thought that was such a great story about how you can tell how a person views themselves. You want to tell that story, Robert?
Absolutely. Oddly enough, that also has to do with the Special Olympics. I was at the California Special Olympics, and the story of the little girl who fell down and got up and fell down and got up. And another year, I was hosting I was at the swimming pool, and I would start everything off with the Star Spangled Banner early in the morning. There were bleachers were around the pool, and call the races and introduce the celebrities as they came in, Maria Shriver and Arnold Schwarzenegger, and just major sports people. And on this one morning, we took a break from the races, and you're screaming and yelling, "You can do it! It's just a little further! Go, 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 go!" And everybody's screaming. And took a break, and I noticed that there was a sort of a semi-famous tennis player there. And I had introduced her earlier. I didn't know who she was or anything like that. I'm not into tennis that much, but she came up to me and said hello, and she said, "Wow, this is really something." And I said, "It's your first time here, right?" And she said, "Yeah." And she said, "Gee, this is watching these athletes. It's just a beautiful thing." And I said to her at one point, before I said anything, she wasn't talking about all of her trophies that she won or, sports or anything like that. She was really just so enamored with the present moment, what she was experiencing. And at one point, I asked her something that I often ask people to get to know them better, other than what do you do for a living or, what's your name, whatever. So shortly after I the introductions there, I said to her, let me ask you something. What do you think is your best quality? And she said, she took a pause and said, that's a good question. She thought, and then finally she said, I think altruistic. She said, I think I'm altruistic. And I said, are you saying that because you're here today? And she said, no, really. She said, when I was a kid, my parents used to tell me that, and, sometimes you lose sight of that. But I think that's really, I think that's one of the best things about me. I think I like to give and help and do those things. And I said, okay. And then that was on a weekend, like a Saturday or Sunday. Well, closing games was on Sunday, so it probably was a Saturday. Friday, Saturday, and Sunday would be the 3 days of the Special Olympics. So on Tuesday of that next week, I was on a commercial audition at Universal Studios for a commercial, and sometimes when you go on a television commercial audition, they partner you with somebody who they kind of sort of think you might be your wife. And for whatever reason, the woman they chose to be my wife was a blonde, very attractive gal with a very short skirt. And which surprised me, but it wasn't what I was expecting. But maybe I wasn't what she was expecting either. So there must have been 20 of us out in the waiting area to go into audition, and you find a little alcove somewhere or go outside or whatever, and you go over your lines and you run. You act out the scene, so to speak. And we worked on our audition, and then took a break, and she's telling me where she's from, and I'm telling her where I'm from, and then we worked on the lines, and that went back and forth. And finally, after about an hour, we went into the audition. We auditioned, we came out, and while I was walking her to her car in the parking lot, I said the same thing to her that I said to the tennis player. I said, so what do you think is your best quality? And she said the same thing. She said, She thought, and then she said, my legs. And yes, you're laughing, and, I didn't know whether to laugh or I didn't laugh, but, I've told this story before where to a large audience, and the audience laughs. And I said, as far as these two people, maybe the way they answered the same question, it seems to me that if they had thought about the person they were, they wouldn't be surprised by the question, or as surprised. What is your best quality? And I've come up with my own answer to that, which I may or may not get to during this interview. But in her case, I thought, maybe because she was at an audition, just the same way I asked the tennis player, are you saying that because you're at the Special Olympics? And she said no. With the actress, who I spent a lot of time with, an hour, just the two of us talking, I don't think that it was because she was at an audition. Am I 100% on that? No, but I had a pretty good feeling that it was not because she was at an acting audition. I think perhaps she had been told her whole life that she was attractive and you should be an actress, and boy, you've got great legs, and et cetera, et cetera. And that's the way she thinks of herself. my best quality is my legs. So as far as the laughter, yes, I was fortunate not to crack up, laughing when I heard it. But it's also deeply sad that at this point in her life, she is thinking that the best quality, what's your best quality? And she says, my legs. It's sad to think that that person thinks that of herself, that she's not seeing all that there is to her, all the tremendous things that are that she's capable of, and looking at herself. And, along those lines, let me interject this here. The reason I wrote this book and stories like this one is to help people from the get-go. Why? My wife, Corrine, said to me, why do you want to write a book? I said, I think I knew the book would help people because of some of these stories I used with the Entertainment Fellowship, and certainly more with the Fireside Fellowship, which I mentioned to you at our church. And it's to help people. It's to help people like that tennis player, just to get an idea that there's more to me than my legs. It's just, I write this to give them the idea that, I can change in ways that will make me happier and more fulfilled. And, in the book, Do You See What I See? Discovering the Obvious, there are stories that are everyday experiences. There are stories that deal with my career in show business, and that was one of them, going on a commercial audition. And there are stories about my faith, where I mention how, in a story on coincidence, how I feel God played a hand in that. And most people, they pray for things, and they beg for things, and they ask for things, and please let this happen. I hope I get this job. I hope this guy likes me. I hope I marry him. I hope he asks, whatever it is. I hope I get a promotion. I hope my report from the doctor will be that I don't have cancer. And then when the answer comes in, after praying and doing all of this, the answer comes in and they don't have cancer, or they get the job, or the guy does fall in love with her. What do? They forget that they asked and prayed and did all of that begging. For me, providence, God's loving care, there have been realities in my life that I can only say that it was God's hand in this, that this happened. And so there are stories in this book about my faith as well and my journey. But I don't, you mentioned something in earlier. I don't know if it was at the beginning of this interview, but when we chatted, when we first contacted each other, David, you talked about bringing your faith to your life. And I did the same. I had an acting studio for years, and I would say, to make a point in directing a couple of actors, I'd say, I went to yesterday at Mass. I went to church yesterday, and I saw this guy. He was so funny, and he was just like this character in this play, or in this scene that you're working on, this screenplay, to two actors. And they would hear me say I went to church. And, with religious bookstores, when you pick up a book and it's about St. Thomas Aquinas or Mother Teresa or the Life of Christ or Fulton J. Sheen, Bishop Fulton J. Sheen, I think people who are searching for something might get turned off, or might not turned off, and turned off, and it's another way of saying, this is too much for me. And I wanted to write a book where I'm just a regular guy, Robert Hanley. I'm a regular guy. This is how I live my life. These are some of the mistakes I made, and God is a part of that. And this is what I have found out on my journey and what I believe. And I don't want to hit people over the head with some of the theology that people don't relate to. These aren't the waters that I fish in. Well, sometimes I do if I'm having it at church. But I want people to understand that by this book and as a reflection of what I've experienced, that they can experience the same thing. And wherever it leads them, I think if they pay attention and analyze themselves, self-awareness of who they are, pretty much what Catholics call, when you go to confession, examine your conscience, examine who you are on a regular basis. For me, ultimately, I think that self-examination has led me to God. I've seen it lead other people to God, and other people it hasn't led to God, but they're still good people. So, from that standpoint, I hope that my goal, mission was to help people by writing this book, and I've seen it make these changes in people's lives, positive changes in people's lives. So that just adds to my fulfillment as a human being.
Well, also, add to the fact that as Christians, we are to help other people, come to Christ. And I agree with you. You have to meet the people in the ordinary life and love them and not shine this bright light of theology on their brains because it blinds people. Which leads me to the other life learning experience. Another good one that I liked was Mommy's Towel. Now, when I read that story, honestly, it reminded me of St. Therese. I don't know if you ever read St. Therese's autobiography. It's called A Story of a Soul. St. Therese of Lisieux is one of my favorite saints.
I think I have a quote of his in the book, but maybe not, but maybe I do. Yeah. I might have considered that at one point, but I didn't read the book.
Yeah, no, but she does a lot of self-reflections. In fact, she has 3 manuscripts, A, B, and C, they're called. And manuscript A, majority of it is just a self-reflection of her upbringing when she was a little girl. So she went into the convent when she was 15 years old. She died at age 23. But the story of a soul, really, it was a self-reflection. And so in one of her stories, she talks about how when she was little, her older sisters who grew up and, she didn't want to play with dolls anymore, decided to give up all her dolls. And so her and her sister, so St. Therese, and her sister Celine, who's also going up for canonization, they're there, they're young kids. The girl says, I don't want to play with it. Her older sister says, I don't want to play with these dolls anymore. So you choose. And Therese, you go first because you're the youngest. And so Therese says, I take everything. I want to take everything. And she reflects how that one moment was how she wanted to be a great saint because she wanted everything and not do things in halves. And so when I read Mommy's Towels, from your perspective, I looked at you as being almost like a little St. Therese, reflecting on something as simple as 2 towels that are never being used, and how the potential of lost talent. So I would like to hear from your side, from you, but I thought it was a great way of expressing how, look at all this lost talent that was there. And this is just reflecting on 2 towels. You know what I mean? It's not even like you're doing something overly. And I think that's the beauty of this book, is that you don't have to be a theologian. You don't have to be a mystic. You don't have to be this Bible expert to realize the greatness and the strength of every human being. And I think the story, which is so simple, and you were able to reflect on it, is so beautiful. So if you don't mind sharing that with us.
I don't mind at all, and I'm just delighted to hear you say that. When I wrote the story, there's another story on the 2 palm trees, and I can remember when I wrote that story, and a friend of mine said to me, he said, Robert, you could look at a garbage can and get something out of it. And that's true, but...
not to cut you off, Robert, but that was my second one, was the two palm trees. I really like that one as well.
Yeah. Well, some of the stories are funny. These were not meant to be funny. Some of them are definitely meant to be funny and are, but I'm getting a kick out of hearing you say what you say. And before I get into the story, let me just say to you and your listeners that this story has to deal with the talent is the chapter title, and it deals. I just told you a lot about me and my life, and there's a world of difference between, spending my day memorizing lines or writing jokes or going to rehearsals and singing and just the different things that I have done in show business, to find myself with the talent to start a group at a Catholic church that is providing things to people that will help them. And I'm giving you a hands-on, from the author, example of using talents that you have not used in your life. So as far as the book is concerned here, Mommy's Towels is about when I was a kid growing up in New York. A little kid, actually, single digits, 6, 7, 8. I couldn't tell you exactly, but you get the idea. And in our bathroom, right by the door, there were hanging 3 towels, not 2, David. But anyhow, the 3 towels were hanging there. And my mother said to me, "Don't use those towels. We're having company today." And my Aunt Dot or Annaline or, different friends of the family would come over, and my mother would get cookies from the Italian deli on White Plains Road in the Bronx, and, the dinner would be a lasagna or something like that. And it was a big deal, as if, I think in the book I mentioned, as if one of the people on the Ed Sullivan Show, for those of you who remember that show, think of Jimmy Fallon today. Somebody on the Tonight Show was going to be at our house. It was like, this is royalty. So I remember thinking, though, because this mind of mine worked that way even then, and I looked at the towels and I thought to myself, gee, these 3 towels, it's kind of odd that the very thing that they were created to do, they're not allowed to do. Wash people's hands and faces. So I began a list of things, and I call it in the book, I think it's Robert's Towel Talent List. Things that other things, uses for talents, uses for a towel that they have that they're not using. And one of them I think is used as a popcorn cover. It keeps the popcorn warm if you put the towel over a bowl. You could put it on a towel on the floor in your bathroom so your feet don't get cold. You could use it as a duster to dust, or even as a napkin, I think. And my mother would faint if she thought, I think I say that. My mommy would faint or something, words to that effect, that using one of those towels to dust would be. So anyhow, the list is 10 or 11 or 12 long of different things that I used, that a towel can be used for. And I also say there are probably many, 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 the list is unending of the uses that you could use a towel for. And then I got to thinking, I wonder if I'm like that talent, if I'm like that towel, if I have talents that I haven't used, and which is the point of the story, that we all have talents that we'd never use. And, people wind up, they're in a job somewhere, and that's their thing. It's their job, come home, eat, raise the kids, whatever. And they forget that there's more to them than that. There are many, many things that we all can do, but for some, and love even more than what we're doing. But for whatever reason, we don't go after it. And, I have seen that with in so many different areas of my life. I remember at my acting studio, I rented from Debbie Reynolds in North Hollywood, and I had an acting studio there for 18 years. And during that 18 years, on 2 different occasions, 2 different guys came in. They were in their mid-30s, and they were airline pilots for like Delta and the other one, American Airlines. I mean, famous airlines. And I couldn't believe the first one, let alone the second one. But in each case, I said, how come you have a great career. How come you're choosing acting? Because it's a lot of work to take an acting class, at least mine. And in each case, they said, I always wanted to act. And, I just wound up being an airplane pilot, and it's been on my mind for 20 years or however many years in their respective cases. And people do that in life and don't realize that they have talents. Not that it has to be acting. As I started off with me, I have a ministry at a Catholic church going into its 9th year. I started something that seemed odd to me. I remember saying to my mother when I started the Entertainment Fellowship, and I said, look, Mom, I'm mailing out 600 newsletters, and actually what she said was, who's going to pay for them? Who's paying the postage? And I said, well, don't worry about it. It'll work out. Typical of an actor or whatever. Typical of me, anyhow. But we have so many other things we could do, and we don't do them, and we don't use them. Not that everybody has to quit their jobs. There's another story in the book, David, on choices when I was having my teeth cleaned at the dentist. And the woman talked about, the woman, I think it leads, there's a part of the same point.
I remember that. That was good.
Yeah, the woman is cleaning my teeth, and she says to me, are you still acting? And I said, yes. And she said, and how things are going? I said, I have a wonderful life. Blah, blah, blah. And she says, to me, she starts telling me about, I ask her what she's doing as best I can with that thing that they put in your mouth.
I know.
Yeah, and so anyhow, she says, I'm married and I have 2 children now since you've seen me. She was away for a while. And she said, I take the kids to school, and it's tough. She says, thank goodness that Dr. D'Angelo, or whatever his name was at the time, it's a good thing he lets me come in and, part-time, just 4 days a week. My husband works at night now. I hardly see him anymore, but it's good that I work during the day and he's with the kids, and then I'm there at night with the kids. And then in the middle of all of this, she stops and she pulls down her green mask, I think it was, and she says to me, how do you do that? And I'm looking at her like, how do I do what? And that's what I said to her, how do I do what? And she said, how do you have a wonderful life? And I said, well, I do. Oh, and she also said, let me go back for a second. She said, before we got married, she and her husband, she said, we used to go dancing and go out a lot and go to the movies. She said, the last movie I saw was Rocky V, she said to me. And then she pulls down the mask. She says, how do you do that and have a wonderful life? And I said, well, I think I have. I said, I love my wife. She loves me. I said, I do things that I enjoy or are meaningful, and I don't do things that I don't enjoy that aren't meaningful. And I expounded on that somewhat, saying, when I was a kid, I'd see people working in a bank, and in one instance, they were not happy. They weren't happy working in a bank. And I thought to myself, working in a bank is not for me, for sure. I can work a 9 to 5. Not that there's anything wrong with that for some people, but that wasn't my life, and I chose to do things that I enjoy doing, et cetera, et cetera. And then she went on to say, "Oh, me too." And she was very nervous. She kept piercing my gums and talking quickly. And she said, "Me too. I have a good life. I mean, don't get me wrong. I love my husband and my children, although I have to take them to school, and then they play tennis, and then I have to drive them to tennis, and then I have to do this, and then I have to take them there." And at one point she said, my friend Lorraine, she was making like 6 figures a year. She's making a really good job. She quit her job and opened a beauty salon. And she's hardly making a living. She works 14, 16 hours a day. She hardly sees her kids. She says, she brings the kids to the beauty salon. She loves them and everything, and they love her. It's fine. But she's working so hard. She's hardly making any money, and she loves it. She loves it. And I'm just listening to this whole thing now as she's cleaning. And she says to me, I want to do something else. People don't realize how hard it is to be a dental hygienist. She says, it's so hard on the fingers and the hands. She says, what I want to do is I want to be a pharmaceutical rep. She says, there's a lot more money in that. And I go, ugh, through the thing in my mouth. She says, yeah. She says, you can make a lot more money. I know. I've observed the reps and the dentist, and I know the field, and it's really a great way to get more money. Ugh. And she says, the simple part of it is you just have to know what people want. You have to listen to what they say. You know what I mean? And I say, yes, I do. She didn't get what I was talking about, and here are things that are going past her observation in light, floating past her observation, where her friend quits a job, where I'm telling her I don't want to be 9 to 5. And it doesn't mean that you can't make a lot of money and be happy. It just means if money's the goal, you're looking in the wrong place.
Exactly.
You need to find out who you are. Yes. What do you value in life? What brings you joy, and go after it. So
yes. So that wraps up our hour. I can listen to you all day. We have talked for hours.
Oh my gosh.
So that does. I'd like to, if you don't mind, have you lead a short prayer. And
I will. But I just want to say, if anybody wants to contact me, just go to www.robert-hanley.com. Is that okay?
Yep, that's fine. If you want to say it again, just to kind of reemphasize it.
Great, thank you. www.robert- that's a dash, Hanley, HANLEY.com. Thank you, David. And thank your listeners as well. Yes, let's say a prayer. In the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Heavenly Father, we come to you at this time to thank you for all the wonderful things that you give us and all the things that you do not let happen to us. We are so grateful to you for these gifts, and we are grateful for the opportunity to share goodness with others. I know I am today, and I know David is. And we pray for your grace to those people who are open to receiving your grace today. Please know they are open for all the things that you have and are. We say and ask this sincerely and humbly through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen. Thanks for listening to me, David Suess, at Practical Catholic. Here's a reflection for you. Take a moment and reflect, who am I? Who do I want to be? Or am I pretending to be something that I'm not? Feel free to share your reflection or leave a comment on the podcast, Instagram, and Facebook at Practical Catholic, or visit my webpage at practicalcatholic1, that is the number 1.com. Join me next week as we discuss the topic of loving our neighbor with true love.
You're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.